Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Technical Assistance Network for Children's Behavioral Health, Cultural and Linguistic Competence Peer Learning Exchange. The Peer Learning Exchange is a webinar or monthly call with topics focusing on culture, health equity, and disparities in child, youth, and young adult behavioral health. Topics are generated by you, individuals working in, being certified, or partnering with behavioral health organizations and system of care states, communities, tribes, and territories. The TA Network, as it's known, is part of the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Children's Behavioral Health for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. My name is Linda Callejas, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Florida and director of the Cultural and Linguistic Competence team of the TA Network. Today's webinar is titled Juvenile Justice Diversion Programs and Disparities, Reduction Strategies in Systems of Care. Today's presentation will discuss juvenile justice disparities and disproportionalities in the United States, examine historical perspectives with regard to the juvenile justice system in this country, and provide information on trauma-informed strategies and approaches designed to eliminate these disparities and reform our justice system. I'm very excited today to welcome the content experts that will be leading this important discussion. I'll begin by introducing all of our presenters and then turn the facilitation of this webinar over to Selena Webster-Bass, who will serve as the first presenter and lead facilitator today. Selena Webster-Bass is the CEO of Voices Institute, a consulting group focused on well-being, multicultural consciousness, and health equity with over 20 years of community health experience. Selena has a Master's of Public Health from the University of South Florida and a variety of professional experiences in medical education, organizational, cultural, and linguistic competence, faith-based partnerships, health equity, mental health, multicultural engagement, and sickle cell disease outreach. She has led national disease education campaigns, conducted organizational self-assessments for various primary care and behavioral health organizations, and served as speaker for various health equity conferences and events. She's also served as a mental health educator and cultural competence educator with the Partnership for Child Health, Jacksonville System of Care for over 5 years. Selena is a certified youth and adult mental health first aid educator, Under Voices Institute, Selena is also a core partner of the TA Network, providing cultural and linguistic competence technical assistance with other behavioral health partners. Next, we have Ayrton Morales. Ayrton Morales is a site manager at the W. Hayward Burns Institute. Ayrton's social and criminal justice career sprung from a critical consciousness that arose from a first-hand narrative of having spent over a decade of his own life navigating California's penal system. Formal and informal education were a definite catalyst to truly understanding the collateral consequences of incarceration and how to successfully navigate a system that has truly devoured people of color over the last 40 years. After being released on parole, Ayrton received his BA and MA and ultimately lectured in the counseling and criminal justice departments for several years at San Francisco State University. Ayrton also went back into the system and taught within the San Francisco County Jail and juvenile facilities for many years. He's also worked with the incarcerated and reentry populations for the last 20 years, supporting youth, women, and men on their journey of transitioning from a correctional setting to an academic setting at San Francisco State via Project Rebound and in the Peralta College system in Alameda County through 5 key schools and programs. Ayrton will be followed by Bree Maselli. Bree Maselli is Youth Program Director with Youth Move National. Bree is on a mission to ensure all youth programs are youth-driven and trauma-informed. She's also Youth Move National's resident data nerd. Growing up as a trauma survivor, Bree felt isolated and had no place to turn but formal systems that did not include her in decision-making. Her experiences drive her passion for this work and organizations like Youth Move National, where youth-driven practices are crucial to helping youth not feel alone in some of their most challenging times. Next, Bree will be followed by Lydia Prull, whose personal pronoun is they, them. Lydia Proul is Youth Program Specialist with Youth Move National. Lydia's own lived experience with mental health, school, and youth leadership drives their education to authentic youth engagement, advocacy, and education. Youth Move National is excited about improving the service delivery model for LGBTQIA2S youth on a national scale. As a former youth program manager at Youth Move Massachusetts and Parent Professional Advocacy League, or PPAL, they led the development of youth peer support groups, youth trainings, and speaking engagements, and the internship program. Lydia will be followed by Betsy Dobbins. Betsy Dobbins is the Executive Director of the Center for Children's Rights, a legal resource and advocacy center for youth. Her advocacy is grounded in restorative practices, healing-centered, and youth-driven. Prior to becoming an attorney, Ms. Dobbins was a social worker who provided mental health services to youth and their families involved in the juvenile justice, child welfare, mental health, and immigration systems. Prior to growing the CCR, Ms. Dobbins worked as an assistant public defender representing youth in the juvenile justice system and adult resentencing hearings for individuals who were sentenced to life without parole as juveniles. Ms. Dobbins has presented nationally and internationally on her resiliency research, which focuses on the intersection of rights and resiliency within reciprocal relationships and transformation as integral to creating community pathways to resilience for youth. Ms. Dobbins is a member of Florida's Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention State Advisory Group and the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice Circuit 4 Advisory Board. Next will be Kevin J. Bethel. Kevin J. Bethel is a retired Deputy Police Commissioner in the Philadelphia Police Department, the fourth largest police department in the nation with over 6,600 sworn personnel. Prior to his retirement in January 2016, Bethel commanded patrol operations for the entire city. This appointment included oversight of the 21 patrol districts, Neighborhood Services Unit, Philadelphia School District Police, and Community Relations Unit. Throughout his career, Kevin has done extensive work in the juvenile justice field, most notably his development of a school diversion program with the Philadelphia school system. This program diverts first-time, low-level juvenile offenders by utilizing programs within the Department of Human Services. Since the inception of the program in 2014, school arrests have been reduced by 71%. Upon his retirement from the Philadelphia Police Department, Kevin has continued to pursue his passion of juvenile justice reform through his work at Drexel University as a senior policy advisor supported by the Stoneleigh Foundation. The Stoneleigh Foundation continues to support Kevin in his current venture, establishing the Law Enforcement Juvenile Justice Institute. Kevin Bethel holds a master's degree in public safety from St. Joseph's University and a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice from Chestnut Hill College. Now, before I turn the mic over to Selena, just a quick reminder that this presentation is being recorded. Your lines will therefore remain muted to help eliminate the background noise. So please feel free to use the chat box to type in any questions or comments during the presentation, and we'll work to address these. In addition, under the public chat box where you can comment and ask questions, you should see a box labeled Files that includes a copy of the PowerPoint being used for this presentation. Finally, please stay on with us a few minutes following the presentation to make sure that you complete the evaluation that will automatically appear upon conclusion of the webinar. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the discussion over to Selena Webster-Bass.
Thank you so much, Linda, and good afternoon to everyone. I am really excited for the opportunity to co-facilitate with national leaders in juvenile justice reform. Today we will highlight historical perspectives of the juvenile justice system, as well as approaches to eliminating juvenile justice disparities with community examples focused on youth engagement, civil citations, teen courts, and school-based diversion programs. So we'd like to start with a video that was developed by the Clayton County, Georgia System of Care entitled Children, Violence, and Trauma Innovations in Juvenile Justice. Here.
Hi everyone, before we start the video, I just want to give a couple of instructions for folks that are connected by telephone to the webinar. You just want to sit down your telephones and unmute your computer speakers as the video audio will play through the computer. So again, be sure to sit down your telephone and unmute your computer speakers. And I'll give about 5 to 10 seconds for folks to get adjusted before I play the video.
And as you watch the video, I'd like for you to think about the adjectives that come to mind when hearing a youth narrative in the beginning of the video, and if you could just type those adjectives in the chat box. And secondly, some of the strategies that are highlighted in the video to address juvenile justice reform.
My mom met a guy, and it was just awful. He would lock us in the basement. He would burn my private areas with cigarettes. At age 12, I was addicted to heroin.
There's always violence on the streets. Fighting, people getting shot, everything.
My brother, they grew up selling dope and stuff like that. When I turned 12, my big brother got shot in the head, and he ain't make it.
I let my anger build up, and I started going down a path of destruction.
We often think about the youth in the juvenile justice system and the risks that they pose to others. We don't often think about the trauma that's happened to them.
Everything that we do here at the Juvenile Court of Clayton County seeks to redirect and rehabilitate young people who've gotten into trouble.
A lot of the children that do come to the attention of the court, there is some sort of trauma in their background. A lot of times it's hidden.
When we do risk and needs assessments to determine why kids get into trouble, we need to start asking, is it because he or she has experienced trauma in their childhood?
If everyone please just look through your package and you can actually see a case that we're going to be staffing.
The Clayton County Collaborative Child Study Team is a bridge between the school system and the providers in the community.
We don't just look at what the offense was, but everything else, family dynamics, things that are going on in the neighborhood, things that are going on in the school.
He's getting in trouble for not following directions, cutting class, doesn't really have a lot of respect for authority figures.
It's a multidisciplinary panel. They meet on a regular basis, and they assess the kid and the family.
This family has some trauma in their lives. His uncle was murdered in the home.
Did you all provide any counseling or therapeutic interventions to help the family out?
We all sit down at the table with the service provider, the school counselor, and social worker, as well as with the parent, and to come up with that plan to modify the child's behavior to keep them from going into the juvenile system. The ultimate goal for the program is to redirect our youth and strengthen family. We will be developing a community intervention treatment plan for him.
One of the greatest first steps in rehabilitation is helping a child, a young person, understand the concept of empathy, to put a face on the person they hurt. For some youth, if they've experienced trauma, there's a part of them that is shut down. Alternative dispute resolution plays a very, very significant role in increasing the competency of the juvenile.
Mediation allows the respondent, along with the victim, an opportunity to resolve their differences with one another versus actually going through a formal process involving the judge.
If we do come up with an agreement and all of the terms are met, then the case will be dismissed.
It is extremely important that the victim has a say in this process.
I want her to face some kind of consequences, because every time
once they have a chance to actually talk with the child and really find out what's really going on, a lot of times the victims will even decide that they want things to be put in place whereby the child can go on to be a productive citizen.
Do you think an apology might be an appropriate first step?
This child hopefully will not have any other court involvement or have any problems at school or in the community.
Anything that I can do to avoid putting a child in detention, I'll do it. If we keep locking this child up, they're with other offenders. They're learning new tricks and trades. They come out and they're gang members now. all we're doing is creating a situation to lock them up as an adult.
All right, let's go over some of the reports.
We now have the Second Chance Court program that focuses on designated felony kids. These are high-risk kids.
You commit a crime, you do wrong, you violate the conditions. That's the only time you need to be scared of me.
It's an alternative to detention. They're on house confinement. They go to school. They can't leave the house unless they're with a parent. They meet with me, and we get reports from all the kids, and the parents are there, and it's an informal setting.
All right, so our first, thank you so much, Pierre. Let's go back to the slide. So our first question was, what adjectives come to mind when hearing the youth narratives in the video? Were there any responses in the chat box? See some individuals are typing. Yes, the video was stopped. We're only showing a portion of the video because of the time. Despair. Thank you. Scared. Fear. So thank you for those adjectives. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to do that is I think it's important to always amplify the youth voice and for us to really use our empathy skills and put ourselves in the shoes of the youth that are oftentimes facing trauma and faced with juvenile justice involvement. The second question was strategies that were highlighted in the video to address juvenile justice reform, and I see that Crystal has typed child and family planning. Kristen has typed an active juvenile detention alternative initiative steering committee and 3 subcommittees that are in their jurisdiction. Yes, and some other things that were mentioned in the video were a trauma-informed approach. There was an assessment process that included the culture and social background of the family, a multidisciplinary approach, as well as diversion. And so those are many examples of what we will be discussing today. So thank you for your input on the video. So one of the key points of the video is that we often don't view youth with juvenile justice involvement as victims of trauma. And so research shows that the majority of youth with juvenile justice involvement have experienced traumatic events, with at least 75% experiencing traumatic victimization. And what we mean by that are traumas related to adverse childhood experiences such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, child neglect. Another study found that in a youth detention center that many youth have experienced multiple traumas, ongoing traumas, and what we call cascading traumas. 90% of youth had experienced at least one trauma, 84% had experienced more than one trauma. And so these traumas, they set the stage for increased vulnerability to physical, mental, and substance use disorders, and ultimately systems involvement. So between 2001 and 2015, overall juvenile placements fell by 54%. So while youth incarceration declined sharply over the last decade, we still see racial disparities. Disparities are increasing. Racial disparities have been a long-time feature of the juvenile justice system. Bias against youth of color has been a feature of the juvenile system since the late 1800s. And studies show that youth of color are overrepresented at key decision points in the juvenile justice system, particularly at arrest, at detention, commitment to a state facility, and transfer to criminal court. As of 2015, African American youth were 5 times as likely to be detained or committed to youth facilities. Latinx youth were 65% more likely to be detained or committed than white peers. American Indian juveniles were more than 3 times as likely to be committed to youth facilities. And developmental research shows that behaviors and characteristics common in adolescence are consistent across races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic status groups. and that rates of child abuse and neglect are no higher in families of color. However, these families are disproportionately involved in the juvenile justice system. So it's really important that we address the overrepresentation of children and families of color and of other cultural groups in our courts. And this requires intentional consideration of policies and practices that drive bias and structural racism. And so an example of structural racism is, for example, beginning as early as preschool, children of color face discriminatory application of school discipline policies. They're suspended and expelled at much higher rates as they move into juvenile justice system. There is also an overrepresentation of LGBTQ+ youth in the U.S. criminal justice system. This shows some data from the Movement Advancement Project. This was a report that was created back in 2017. It shows that approximately 7 to 9% of youth in the United States identify as LGBTQ youth. 20% of youth in juvenile justice facilities identify as that population. 40% of girls that are incarcerated identify as LGBTQ, and 14% of boys that are incarcerated identify as LGBTQ. So we see that these disparities and disproportionalities are not just based on color, but also based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So it's really important that we address systemic bias and that court systems are asking specific questions such as, are my own personal experiences, culture, and background preventing me from making informed decisions? Is reliable data being used for court recommendations or decisions? If a youth has failed to appear in court, has court personnel even asked or inquired about the reasons behind that failure? Is it transportation or failed to receive the notice? So these are some of the questions that we should ask when we're considering systemic bias. So one of the frameworks that we use in addressing health equity are the National Standards for Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Services. These standards were developed by the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Minority Health, and these standards are 15 action steps. It's a blueprint for eliminating disparities. And these standards are to assist systems partners and behavioral health care organizations in implementing culturally responsive practices and service delivery. So the principal outcome of these standards is to provide equitable, effective, understandable, and respectful services with families. And so there are 3 themes that I'll quickly go through: governance, leadership, and workforce development, communication and language assistance, engagement, continuous improvement, and accountability. So as we think about the juvenile justice system, across those first set of themes, leadership, governance, and workforce development, it's important that our leadership and workforce is diverse and inclusive in our juvenile justice system. It's important, as was mentioned in our chat box, that we have diverse racial and ethnic committees that are addressing these disparities. It's important that we also have family and youth voice as a part of our work, diverse family and youth participation, that we're training on implicit and explicit bias within our juvenile justice system, and that we have specific recruitment, hiring, and retention goals. This is just an example of a health equity committee that includes family, youth from the community, judges, public defenders, individuals that are stakeholders, that are systems partners in addressing the issues that we see in terms of disproportionalities in the juvenile justice system. The next set of themes are across communication and language access. And this means that it's important, for example, in our juvenile justice assessment centers, that language access services are provided, that we're establishing language access contracts, that we're training staff on language access, on LGBTQ terminology, person-first language, and other ways to effectively exchange information with diverse and multicultural families. This shows a meeting, town hall meeting of various stakeholders about a juvenile justice reform movement in a local community. And the final set of standards are across engagement and continuous quality improvement. And this is an important focus area here, because this has to do with data. And so it's really important that communities are just aggregating their data to determine baseline data and to inform their disparities reduction strategies. It's also important that communities are conducting organizational assessments to gauge how responsive they are to differences, to review policy, to make sure that they're addressing disparities and disproportionalities. And so this is just an example of one form of assessment by creating a systems map, looking at data across these various decision points in the juvenile justice system. So this is our introduction to our webinar. I'd like to turn our webinar over to Ayuto Morales, who's going to cover the historical perspective of youth of color in the juvenile justice system.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Ayuto Morales. I am a site manager with the Burns Institute. The Burns Institute is a national nonprofit based out of Oakland, California. Over the last 17 years, we've worked with over 200 jurisdictions, eliminating racial ethnic disparities in youth and adult systems, and we've also worked in certain jurisdictions addressing racial ethnic disparities in school systems as well. And the way we go about doing this is basically bringing community and system stakeholders through a data-driven process. And the idea is the outcome that we want is to basically create community-based alternatives to, alternatives to incarceration in specific. There's an important thing to note in this, process. I'm kind of oversimplifying, the process, but community engagement is a key to addressing racial ethnic disparity work in order to have accountability and sustainability. Once after we finish the work with a specific jurisdiction and the BI is no longer present, we want to make sure that community is still present in the work, and also, right, that the system stakeholders have that accountability piece from the community, and that they also have the sustainability to keep the work going on. And data, as was just mentioned too, is should be broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, geography, and offense as well. So that's a real important aspect when we are looking at data, is to not just pull data, but make sure that data is pulled according to REGO, right? Race, ethnicity, gender, geography, and offense. The Burns Institute, we basically address racial ethnic disparities as they manifest themselves via overrepresentation of youth of color in the system, disparate treatment of similarly situated youth as we find them in detention centers across the nation, and also unnecessary entry or deeper penetration into the system. A quick disclaimer about this presentation. This is a very, very brief snapshot of a much longer and detailed presentation on the history of youth justice system the BI traditionally presents. So I'm going to do my best to condense over 400 years of history in the allotted time by giving you a few highlights, but just, bear in mind that, the history is quite complex and deserves ample time to unpack and discuss. So feel free to reach out, once the webinar is over, if you want to know a bit more about the RED history training. So let's go back in time and reflect on pivotal points in time that allowed structural racism to have a strong foothold within the youth justice system as we understand it today. Interestingly enough, religion played a huge role, right, in the punitive manner in which youth were treated from the outset. The punitive nature and approach stems from early belief systems and values of the Puritans dating back to the 1600s. The Puritans perceived young folks as evil and sinful and in need of salvation and redemption, and as a result, discipline was severe and strict, so severe in fact that the first death penalty or capital offense for disobedient wayward youth was created based on the biblical text of Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18 through 21, which called for the stoning of a stubborn or rebellious child, concluding that evil must be purged from among them, right? And this was known as the stubborn child law. At this point in time, in the 1600s, the decision-making power was in the hands of the parents, and it was later on that it shifted to the state or to systems as to what was in the best interest of young folks. And since no juvenile justice system existed at the time, the default system for young folks was what existed as the adult system of that time, right? And as a result of abuses and atrocities that youth suffered in the adult system over time, what ended up emanating was the New York House of Refuge, came into existence to address the unique needs of children and youth. And this came around 1825. However, young folks of color, youth of color, were excluded to participate in the so-called rehabilitative services that were offered from the House of Refuge, and suffered the horrid conditions of the adult system for approximately an additional decade until the colored section was opened in 1834. So as we see a result of abuse and neglect, the system was born, but it was born inherent with structural racism embedded into the structure. And along with that was, not allowing youth of color into the system was the way that youth of color were viewed, right, as feeble-minded, unworthy of rehabilitative services. Some young folks were understood as property. And so, all of this together, did not allow youth of color to basically have access to these services. So, I'm going to ask a quick rhetorical question. Has much changed? Right? No. In my opinion, no, right? Even with all the technology that we have today, cameras and all of these different facilities across the nation, we still see youth suffer abuse at the hands of the overseers, whether in youth justice systems, immigration detention centers, school systems, etc. Abuse and disparities are still prevalent. So the next facet of the system is probation. It came a little bit later in 1848, and in fact was created by a community member named John Augustus, who was a bootmaker. He actually would go and try to get young folks and adults out by bailing them out with his own money and teaching them his trade or vocation of bootmaking, and basically providing them with support and a job, and basically allowing them to kind of provide for themselves as time went on as they learned the trade. By 1899, the Illinois Juvenile Court Act passed and created a separate court from the adult court system, and started to hear cases of youth under 16. So this brings us to the 1900s. By this time, whole houses were being established across the nation. There was 100 in the U.S. altogether and 35 in Chicago alone to provide social programs like child care, education, recreation, and employment services. But discrimination and segregation continued and now had become institutionalized in systems springing up across the nation, resembling what we know as the youth justice system today. So although all of these whole houses and all of these systems were popping up and assisting, what were understood as immigrant children at that time, Irish, Italian, Jewish folks and stuff like that, and they were getting the services, youth of color were still not having access to these services, right? So let's fast forward, right, and take a snapshot of the youth justice system from 1985 to 2010. And this graph basically covers a time period of 25 years from 1985 to 2010 in which a host of legislation contributed to what we understand as the darkening of the system. If we look at the first circle in 1985, 28% of the youth of color were in the public detention centers across the nation versus 72% white youth in 1985. And then if we look back, into 2010, there was 71% youth of color and 29% white youth. And so there were many elements that contributed to this shift in composition. One of them was the war on drugs, the Central Park jogger case, the super predatory theory that was coming out of academia, and the media itself, who, kind of perpetrated the idea of the super predator theory. And so these together provided the catalyst for a cocktail of disparities under the guise of legalities and scholarships that spread through the media to appeal to the fear of youth of color as super predators. And me, myself, I was actually confined in the California Department of Corrections around this time from 1995 to 2005, and, was allowed to witness, a lot of the influx of young folks of color receiving life sentences. And what ended up happening in California was also, the 3 strikes law that was enacted as a result of the murder of Polly Klaas. They used that fear-mongering tactic in terms of, saying that, there was violent murder rapists out. But in fact, what they ended up using that law for was to basically sentence folks for stealing, batteries, bicycles, TVs, and stuff like that. And so there was a huge influx of young folks who were committing misdemeanor crimes who were thrust deep into the system and receiving life sentences as a result. young folks who were present at crimes, and who actually didn't commit maybe a violent crime or specifically a homicide, or ended up getting life sentences. A lot of these laws are changing, but it's almost like 20 some odd years later, when the Three Strikes Law was enacted in 1994, we see, the ramifications and collateral consequences of, having folks have been in the system for over 16, 17 years, and not really necessarily having committed a crime, but just being present or in a car when someone committed a crime. So now let's briefly take a look at how the Burns Institute would address racial ethnic disparities. The BI strategy for reducing racial ethnic disparities is basically this roadmap that we have. Number one is to identify the disparities. Number two is to identify, analyze, and strategize around a target population. And the last would be to measure progress. And so this is an example of some work that we did in a specific jurisdiction. And so when we identify disparities, it's really important to use different data metrics when looking at data such as percentage versus rate. Rates can sometimes highlight problems with disparities that percentage won't show. So if there's a high proportion of youth of color in the general population, rates can reveal the disparities. And so once we kind of pull the data from a specific jurisdiction, it allows us to see, the data basically tells us, yes, disparities exist, but then we don't know why, right? So the second portion of our, strategizing around our target population is to start developing the qualitative data and sitting down with community. So, right, that is the important piece of bringing community to the table, is to basically have access to the resources in the community, have that community voice of folks that have been through that specific system, organizations who work within that system, and voices of parents also at the table, and to be able to kind of understand what that individual is going. Kind of like in the only distinction, right, in the film at the beginning, right, was what you didn't see. At least I didn't see. I might be wrong. Maybe there was some young folks in there, but our methodology would have been a little different, where you have folks at the table, young folks who have been through the system at the table, and basically advocating for themselves through interviews, community advisory boards, and so on and so forth. And the last portion is the importance of measuring progress, so that once the Burns Institute has left a specific jurisdiction, the community and the system will basically understand how to pull data, how to conduct these interviews with community, and they'll be able to see their progress, if they're going in the right direction or not. And so once usually when we go into a jurisdiction, we have to kind of focus on a specific target population. So if you look at under number two, right, the highest disparities existed with warrants and what's understood as violations of probation. So say, for instance, in the first go-around, we may have just wanted to focus on warrants. So once this strategy is done, we may double back and then want to go and look and dig deeper into the violations of probation, and dig into what is causing these aspects of folks to be violated, right? So like in the note, the case file, a review of youth detained due to violation of probation, and focus groups with providers led to the development of an evening reporting center by a local run boys and girls club, right? So the idea is and that's another aspect of bringing community into it, is that once you bring community who traditionally work with young folks versus system stakeholders, is that you already have access to resources that exist, and it's just a matter of system stakeholders partnering with community and allowing either community to run these programs, so that young folks who have already been working with the people in the community feel a lot more comfortable opening up, and so you can measure progress in the same way in the community. And so some takeaways about this, right, is that the history, structure of race, bias, and decision making within the youth justice systems continues to play a significant role in the outcomes for youth of color. Data-driven strategies must lead equity reform efforts for policy and practice enduring changes. And last but not least, community engagement and equal partnerships must be part of the equity reform practices. And the Burns Institute, we actually have what we call the Racial Ethnic Disparity Training 101, where we actually discuss each one of these in length in terms of the historicity of the youth justice system, the different methodologies of collecting data, and also, strategies and bringing community to the table. And there's also an aspect of fundamentals, right, of, all the subtleties that exist in terms of bringing, a collaborative together. The work of addressing racial ethnic disparities within a specific jurisdiction is not an easy task, because there's a lot of, feelings involved around, discussing, racial ethnic disparities. And so, it takes, some time and to bring about, a lot of these different facets of, how that looks like. And it all depends on who's in the room. It all depends on what kind of things are going on within the community, the trauma, young folks getting killed at the hands of, police officers, or, young folks getting abused within the system. And so, it's a real delicate situation to be able to go into a specific jurisdiction and bring folks together so that they can actually, improve systems and allow for folks to actually, in the community and system-involved folks to actually have a voice. And so, we actually have a training that covers all of that. So thank you, and appreciate, being able to be a part of this presentation. Our next speakers are Bree Maselli and Lydia Prue.
Thanks so much. So let's get some slides here. Thanks. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about how juvenile justice systems can partner with youth-run organizations and what youth engagement might look like within sort of the juvenile justice system and your work. The Youth Move National is a youth-driven, we're a chapter membership organization. We have 66 chapters in 33 different states, including some tribal chapters. And we are dedicated to improving services and systems that serve youth. That can include mental health systems, behavioral health, juvenile justice, education, child welfare, and so on. MOVE stands for Motivating Others Through Voices of Experience. So the way that we really encourage our member base to affect change is by sharing their voices of lived experience, what they've been through, via advocacy and leadership activities to really improve the systems that they've been through for the generation coming up behind them, so that the systems can actually help rather than harm and do the job that they should have done for those young people. And so we really encourage that through storytelling and through advocacy. Our model is a capacity building model that supports young people who are using services, the communities in which they live, and the actual services and support systems that support them. So it's kind of a three-tiered angle. We've got the individual level, community level, and then the service system level. Chapter models often consist of programming that is, well, it consists of program that's young adult driven and data informed that builds upon peer connections. It'll promote learning and growth, develops partnerships and collaboration, identifies service and support gaps, seeks to improve access to quality services, and unites the voice and causes of youth. And so this can be done in really formal settings. We have some chapters that are located within residential facilities, within different hospital settings, and we have some chapters that are drop-in and very informal in how they offer that peer support and build connection, learning, and growth. They provide training and technical assistance on best practice approaches to youth and young adult-driven care as part of the TA network. Many of our chapters are also providing, they're advising and sort of supporting systems and communities at the local level on how to improve local systems and services. So on the left here, we have our definition of youth-driven. It means that young people have the right to be empowered and educated, and that they have a decision-making role in the care of their lives, but also within the policies and procedures that are governing things for the whole community, for all the youth, for state level and the national level. This means those young people have a sustainable voice, and that we are listening to that voice. Youth-guided organizations create safe environments that enable young people to gain self-sustainability in accordance with the cultures and beliefs that they identify with. So it's not just young people coming into a room and adult partners doing whatever those young people say. It's a sustainable partner voice. Further, youth-guided approach recognizes that there's a continuum of power that should be shared with young people in a strengths-based change process. Youth-guided organizations also recognize that this process should be fun and worthwhile. We know that for a high rate of engagement, high level of engagement, the process needs to be fun and they need to be getting something out of that process as well. If you look to our 6 organizational purpose areas, many of our chapters, I would say, are involved 2 to 3 of these. We're sort of still looking at our current annual report data. So Bree, jump in. I know you've been reading them a little bit more closely than I have in the past week or 2. But you'll see that our chapters are involved with peer service delivery. Again, that can be informal to formal. It kind of spans this continuum. They're offering recreation and peer networking. They're doing community involvement activities and advocacy activities. They're doing social marketing and awareness building, different campaigns throughout Facebook, Instagram, all those sort of platforms. There's youth voice development and lots of leadership training, and then personal development and empowerment. None of our chapters are involved with all of these areas, but they are sort of their strengths lie in 2 or 3 of them at a time. And so the benefits of youth engagement and partnership that we see are they contribute to the designing and implementation of new policies. Apologies for that typo there. The designing and implementation of new policies. This is really about sort of user-informed and data-informed design. We know that those policies, those practices will be more relevant and sort of more effective for young people if young people have a voice in designing them and sort of that implementation process. Youth engagement and partnership changes institutional culture and practice. It affects a change within your workplace. If young people are perceived and treated and are valued as collaborators at the table, there is a sharing, again, a sharing of that power that really changes the feel of a work environment, and you start to change the culture towards not that youth are people who we do a service to, that have something happen to them, but they are partners in how that service, that we're doing this with them. Youth engagement builds awareness and common understanding among youth and adult partners, builds a sense of community, and people begin to feel that they really belong in their larger community, not just in little alcoves that we kind of carve out for young people. Builds self-efficacy, so that's part of the leadership development, advocacy development, and improves individual and organizational outcomes. So when youth are engaged in the design, implementation, and evaluation of programs, services, or even their own treatment plans, we know that they are more engaged, their peers are more engaged with that service, and we see better outcomes. This is a table that can help us understand the roles and opportunities where youth voice and youth engagement can really affect change. So to the left, we have inform. If young people are informing our work, they might be helping us design websites. They might be working on media releases. They could be hosting open houses and developing fact sheets, brochures, leaflets, that sort of work. If they're consulting, they might be the subject of or running focus groups. They might be completing surveys and really helping us understand their perspective. Same with interviews, suggestion boxes is really where we're collecting information from their perspective. When young people are engaged and involved, they're co-leading workshops. They are serving as expert panelists. They're developing, reviewing, and disseminating materials and projects. This is kind of the space where we really see that youth engagement requires a lot of prep, a lot of coaching, support for young people to understand the role and to understand how it can affect the work. And then on the other side of that, once the task is done, for example, once the workshop is done, how are we debriefing and looking at how can we improve and what needs to change for next time in a way that is supportive to that young person's development. Once they're collaborating, they are working on advisory groups. They're helping us understand how we can affect change maybe at a system level. So for example, government groups or I know that JDAI and different initiatives around juvenile justice have advisory bodies where youth and family members can give feedback and really participate in sort of sharing their story, what they've been through, but in a way that can affect how the policy is developed and then implemented. that sort of goes along with youth advisory groups. They may be liaisoning to provider and policy groups. We have some young folks in our network who are working as young people, usually in pairs of two. We encourage pairs of two, so they have a co-young person to work with, where they're sort of liaisoning between state meetings or city meetings, such as city council, and then coming back to their Youth Move chapter to get more feedback and sort of bring that voice up to the city or state or national level. And then when they're empowered, they are on steering committees. They have an authentic, again, sustainable decision-making role. They are hired in staff roles or peer roles as youth peer support providers. We know that in juvenile justice, we've seen youth peer support provider roles kind of come out, and how are they helping other young people currently in the system with their story. And they become leaders in the youth movement and family movement. And so all across these examples at the bottom here in this orange area, we have our trauma-informed principles, which really inform how we involve and engage young people and families. So we have some examples for you. I know, Bree, feel free to hop in with yours as well. For example, Youth Move National, staff participated in the convening and development, along with young people in recovery, of the OJJDP's Juvenile Drug Treatment Court Guidelines document, able to give feedback and sort of participate in the development of those guidelines. And we've had, with the JDAI initiative, we've had chapters that have worked to inform juvenile justice systems about policies that have been harmful to them that have kind of been overlooked. We've had one chapter that a member was coming back into the community, and he shared that, while he was in detention, none of his siblings were allowed to visit him. And so when he was coming back to the community, he had a relationship with his parents, but his younger siblings didn't really know him, and he didn't really have a connection with them. And that's really a lost natural support, right? That's really something we want young people to have when they return to the community, that they are close to their families, because we know it's a major support. And so by sharing his story and advocating and working with the Family and Youth Committee members of JDAI, he was able to affect that change in his community and his state, and now siblings are allowed to visit their older siblings or their siblings in detention. Bree, do you have examples you would also like to share?
Sure, thanks, Lydia. So to kind of build upon some of the examples that either National or Lydia shared about JDAI initiatives, is that we also have a lot of our chapters that are partnering at a systemic and local program level with juvenile justice directly. And so we have a lot of youth peer-oriented courts where they're using a peer support model to hold kind of first-time offenders accountable. And our local youth programs in our local states are actually the facilitators and the conveners of a lot of those programs locally. We also have a lot of programs that are serving as diversion sites. In my community in Maine, when I was the youth coordinator, that's really what we did in our program. And so when young people were involved in the justice system, and we served as a diversion center, part of our Youth Move program was that juvenile justice would refer. We would complete these great assessment tools to really work on the strengths of the young people and then match them to an appropriate diversion type program that not only would help them meet the judicial requirements, but also help them gain skill and see this experience as a learning and growing opportunity, as well as building positive peer connections with the rest of the youth in the program. And so all of our chapters, so we have those chapter purpose areas. That peer support domain and that skill development domain are starting to become higher on our priority list with our chapters, that we're seeing our chapters forming more strategic partnerships with juvenile justice, and they're doing that through these more service-oriented options of that diversion, peer support, so utilizing peer support to go into the juvenile facilities and support with transitioning out, so that there's a peer support worker that is a young person that has had that experience, kind of helping them transition back into community, because we know that that's really hard, going from one setting and then trying to re-enter back into the peer network when your peers might not be positive peers to reconnect with. And so how do you find that new peer group? And our programs are being that, an example of that within the local programs. Do you want to go to the next slide, Lydia?
I think so, yes. And so that's sort of what we're seeing. And so I'm going to hand it off now to Betsy Dobbins with the Center for Child Rights.
Thank you. So thank you everyone that's on the call. I've really been enjoying the speakers so far. I'm with the Center for Children's Rights. We're a very small nonprofit in Jacksonville, Florida, and we focus on being a legal resource and advocacy center for kids and young people with a focus on policy and practice reform within our local and state juvenile justice practices. So I'm going to cover very briefly some big topics related to juvenile justice, and I think one of the key takeaways that all of us can hold on to today is one of the best ways to reduce disparities in the juvenile justice system is to keep kids out of that system to begin with. And so that's what I'm going to take a little time to talk about. And most of my presentation includes some nuts and bolts examples of processes and systems that localities have put into place and how those are having impact on the populations of youth and disparities. So civil citation is an alternative to arrest. It is a formal notice that is issued prior to a child's arrest. The goal is to connect youth to needed services as well as holding youth accountable. Civil citation is really important because for many reasons, but when we think about what many of our kids have experienced that have created pathways to the juvenile justice system, we know that the experience alone of arrest can be a very traumatizing experience. For example, here in Florida, our children who are under arrest are placed into handcuffs. They are arrested and booked, so fingerprints, photographs. They are transported to a juvenile assessment center, and then if they are transferred into a detention center, that involves additional kind of traumatic experiences, strip searches, solitary confinement, and all of the things that go along with detention. So civil citation is really key because it is an intersection at that point prior to that entire arrest process. So Florida, our road for civil citation has been a long one. You know, really the authorizing statute was passed back in 1990, and now 2018, we just recently expanded our laws again. And I provide that timeline because I think, you know, it can be helpful to think about how things at the local and state level align as we begin to build these additional processes and checks and systems along the way that become checkpoints on these equity issues and well-being issues for our kids as they are impacted by these systems. So this graphic is available on our Department of Juvenile Justice website. It really just outlines the flow. So a civil citation occurs in the community. The arresting or responding officer has the discretion in that moment to make a determination whether or not to issue a child a civil citation. If the officer chooses to issue the child a civil citation, they simply give them a piece of paper, and then documents are processed. For us, here locally in the 4th Judicial Circuit, our civil citation program is run through our clerk of court office, and so it consists of a teen court and a neighborhood accountability boards. We have 4 of those who are spread throughout our local area. There's an intake process where they're really providing assessment for youth, trying to determine what their needs are and what the most effective interventions are going to be. They do the referrals for services and the case management component. They put interventions in place. It still is in some ways a punitive model. That accountability piece, at least from a cultural perspective for our local community, has really been key to get key stakeholders on board, like our local law enforcement officers, so community service hours, apology letters, that sort of thing. And again, if the child is successful with the civil citation, there's no arrest record, no formal paperwork to be expunged or sealed. If for some reason a child is not successful in completing the civil citation requirements, then it would be referred to the state attorney's office, who would then continue with processing. We really had an issue with disparities and with just low issuance of civil citations to begin with. Back in 2015, I'm sharing some data. Our numbers were really, really low. So less than 30% of kids who were eligible to get civil citations were being issued them. And then when we disaggregated that and really looked at what that looked at by, what that looked like or was experienced as for children by race or ethnicity, the disparities became quite concerning. And so the benefit is that our Department of Juvenile Justice maintains a very robust data system. And the civil citation was required to upload all of this data into that dashboard so that it was publicly available to all community stakeholders. Anyone who wanted to look at the issuance rate, at the disaggregated data rates, had access to go in and do that and really play around and familiarize themselves with the data. And this became really key because it really allowed the community to coalesce support for civil citation. Mrs. Webster-Bass shared that Nehemiah Assembly at the beginning of the presentation, and that is a powerful community group who was one of the leading proponents for expanding the use of civil citation and really recognizing the benefits of reducing youth entry points into the juvenile justice system. And so they were really able to leverage that available data at a community level with community stakeholders to really hold community leaders accountable to the data. And so what we've seen here is a real switch, and that has been in part because of a parallel effort at the state level to expand the legislative definition of what's eligible for a civil citation, as well as local efforts to more closely align our practices with the fully expanded statute. And so another key aspect is that our state attorney's office really monitors the data and the outcomes. So now if officers choose not to issue a civil citation to a child who is eligible, on the arrest and booking report, there is a section where they have to report why they, in their discretion, chose not to issue a civil citation to a child who was eligible. And the state attorney's office reviews that. And that's been really key because that level of accountability has really allowed training issues to be identified, and now our utilization, I believe, is around 90%. So diversion can be pre-arrest or post-arrest. Obviously, we like it better if it is pre-arrest, but we also like post-arrest because, again, it creates a pathway away from the traditional juvenile justice system and avoids some of those collateral consequences of juvenile justice involvement that come with adjudication or charges being pressed against a child. So diversion is a really important mechanism to disrupt the juvenile justice disproportionalities. When we think about the context of the school to prison pipeline, we see kind of correlations between high rates of suspension and school push out, and then the rates of what happens with the pull-in process. So kids are pushed out of school and then they're pulled into the juvenile justice system when there's not effective diversion processes or systems in place. So the video that you all saw with Clayton County, Georgia, they really are a model, and they really have done a great job with using their data to really put into place systems and processes that create consensus and agreement that also monitor data in an ongoing way, and really work to reduce disparities, and also really work to reduce overcriminalization of kid behaviors. So part of that pull-in process of the school-to-prison pipeline is overcriminalizing behaviors that an adult, for example, would not be criminalized for. So things like truancy, things like disrespect or defiance in the classroom setting. Those are school issues, not juvenile justice issues, and it's important to draw that distinction and draw those lines. So they, in their model, created a focus act decision tree that was solidified by a memorandum of understanding. And that focus act became really key because, again, it began to define more clearly what is a delinquent act and what is an act of misbehavior. And when we think in the context of implicit and explicit biases, clearly defining and drawing lines and boxes around those things reduces those discretion points and increases accountability and conversation if there is disparate treatment or disparate perceptions about behaviors and delinquent acts. The role conflict avoidance tree, decision tree, is also a helpful tool that they developed in Clayton County. This helped to, again, delineate that role between school resource officers or law enforcement professionals who are on the school campus and the role of school staff. So again, creating a system to clearly delineate the roles and clearly delineate the behaviors and draw that line so that we reduce further that pull-in process of the school-to-prison pipeline. So this just kind of highlights the change in our civil citation at a local level. And again, you know, if we think from a systemic perspective, building in these checkpoints, so incorporating that into documentations and forms so that the entity, whatever that entity may be, is providing oversight, can really get a sense of how is discretion being utilized and is it being utilized appropriately, and are there additional factors at play that may be contributing to inequity or further issues. So restorative justice can be incorporated throughout the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system as well. But really it's just a different frame or a lens of thinking about things from our traditional punitive response. So it really is focused on what is the harm and how has it impacted relationships. And that's really key because it's valuing young people for the role in the relationship that they have, whether it's with that alleged victim or whether it's within the community. It's placing value on that young person and the need to create space for that young person to right a wrong or to repair a harm so that they can maintain that space and that role and value in the community. So there are lots of different types of restorative justice practices. The victor offender mediation was an example that was shown in the video. There's restorative justice conferences, family group conferencing, family group decision-making, restorative justice circles, restorative cautioning, restorative dialogue, classroom conferencing, formal conferences. And again, what really defines those practices is what is the purpose, what is the intent, and what is the goal? Is it really to repair a harm and to build a skill, or is it to punish? So this may segue well for Mr. Bethel, who will be presenting next. But if we think about restorative justice, it goes beyond just the immediate intervention to repair a harm that has happened. It is also about creating a culture and community that's focused on relationships and on healing rather than punishment. And it can have really powerful effects and really make things better for kids in a lot of ways. So there's a couple of model programs. One, there's a Legal Rights Center in Minnesota. They do family group conferencing as an alternative to kids being suspended or expelled. There's also a group in Baltimore, Restorative Response Baltimore, who does responsive circles and community conferencing. Again, offering those opportunities for healing and growth for the young person, to not just be punished for a mistake, but to learn from it and to build relationship from it. So key takeaways are utilizing those alternatives, reducing discretion points, establishing a new presumption, so rather than punishment, growth, healing, that robust data and monitoring. The accountability is really key for that disaggregated data. And then, really focusing on relationships for kids, no correction without connection, and healing and repairing harm as a focus and not punishment. So now I will turn it over to our final speaker, who is Kevin Bethel with the Law Enforcement Juvenile Justice Institute.
Okay, Betsy, well, thank you for that. And it's a good setup because I work with Judge Steve Teskey from Clayton County, and much of my work initiated through his work. So I appreciate that dialogue. And so what I'm going to share with you is a kind of a law enforcement perspective, as I became very much involved in juvenile justice. As the deputy commissioner in the Philadelphia Police Department. The last 8 years I was deputy, and I started to really make this transformation around juvenile justice and this proportionality of the arrests we were working with young people. That would carry me into our school setting, which I would then begin the process of looking at the schools and what were we actually doing in the schools. And so as you see depicted, zero tolerance was very much in place in our schools in the city of Philadelphia. And I often caution folks that zero tolerance was happening in the community at the same time. So we are practicing the broken windows theory. We are really much engaged and lining with the actions of the school, in which you handle the small things in the schools, the big things will not happen. As a result, in the city of Philadelphia, we added metal detectors to all of our schools. And one of the biggest dynamics what happened, we would add 320 school police officers. So they're state police officers, they're actually security officers. They're not sworn officers. We don't have officers with weapons in our schools. But those 320 school officers handle all the behavior in the school and have the ability to make the arrest and call for one of the Philadelphia police officers to come and make that arrest. As a result of that, we had an enormous number of suspensions, but those suspensions have reduced almost 50% now because of the work being done in school. But one of the biggest things key was these 1,600 kids were being arrested in our school district every year. 80% of the kids were African American, even though the school was 54%. And it was just an enormous number of kids who were being arrested for, as was indicated in many of previous speakers, low-level offenses, minor things that when I went into the public school system could never, ever imagine would be arrested for. The school district at this point was driving the largest percentage of our kids were coming into the system were coming in from the school district. And so one of the approaches we would look at is what could we do to change this? And one of the big issues was, first looking at our system. We have the largest school district, 1/8 largest school district in the nation, 218 schools, 134,000 students, another 40 or 50,000 are in our charter setting, 320 schools, and then we have 84 sworn officers. And so one of the things that we would look at was how could we change this process? My position was, why was I locking up children, minimum age of 10 years of age, for coming to school for fighting, to coming to school with a weapon, not a gun? We all on this call and anyone in the public agree that kids should not come into school with a gun. But how did a child carrying mace to protect herself going to and from school become an offense? How did a kid who was being bullied, who brings a butter knife to school, could be arrested? Why would a kid who get into a mutual fight, no injuries, was not a code of conduct issue and now a policing issue? Why are all of these things occurring? And more importantly, why did law enforcement, in particular our case, and myself as overseeing it, allowing my officers to use in that position? So we would make a very strong determination that we were no longer going to do it. And I can share with you, I remember today walking into my commissioner's office and saying, I will not lock up children anymore for these low-level offenses. And he turning around saying, what do you want to do? I want to do a pre-arrest school diversion program. What we would find is of the 1,600 kids we were locking up every year, almost 85% of those kids were being diverted the next day. My question was, well, if they're being diverted the next day, then why are we putting these children through the trauma of the arrest. If you already are indicating by releasing them the next day and putting them into the youth aid panel in the community, they did not need to be arrested. And so we took the position that we would no longer put these children through the trauma of going through a physical arrest, and we would do that up front. As we would build a collaboration, but I'm very strong in this conversation and to the audience as well that this was going to be a police-led initiative, that law enforcement was going to no longer allow the school district or those working on that behalf to tell me to take a child's freedom away. They did not have the authority to do that, nor should we be just arbitrarily giving it away. And so we would re-empower ourselves that we would do that and build a collaboration of those on the screen. The school district, but I built the program. We built the program to come to the steps, but the school district was already making changes within their school around their code of conduct. The district attorney's office. But the reality was, since I was in charge of the kids, I didn't need the district attorney's permission, but I wanted them to be a support on our team. The Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative was a great place for me to go because the system leaders were there as we would make these decisions about doing a pre-arrest diversion. The head of the leadership in the Department of Human Services, who runs all of our programs in the schools, would offer to us the ability to divert kids to programs in the community that were already part of their system and already part of this criminal justice system. And then I would bring Jacksonville University on board to do the research. The Department of Human Services will be a great component in this process. And so how would it look? The incident would occur. Normally the officer would would be contacted by the school security officer, and we just made the arrest. That was it. This is a three-start process. We would say no. We're going to determine what offenses we're not going to arrest a kid for. So we determined marijuana, fighting in schools, coming to school with a weapon, not a gun. We were locking up kids who were trespassing, who would get suspended and come back the next day and arrive at school, go into the classroom, and we would go in there and arrest them for trespassing. It made no sense. So once we determined what those offenses are, serious offenses we did not divert, but all the summary and misdemeanor offenses we would. We created an intake center where we put 2 Philadelphia police officers in the Department of Human Services to partner with them. When the officers come to the school and they make contact with that youth, there's only a couple things we want to know. What is the offense? If they've ever been arrested before. If they have a prior, they cannot be diverted, but they'll be available for the youth aid panel. 99% of my kids are eligible. That is it. I don't want to hear any of the implicit biases that leak into the system. I don't want to hear about his or her grades, that they didn't smile to you in the morning. It's really about, what is getting the kid into the program. Once we do that, the officer, where he would used to do an arrest, he would give that youth and their family a letter. That letter says within 72 hours, a social worker, all the time accompanied by the police officer, is coming to the home. This is not about dependency. This is all about moving the youth into programs. So none of my kids go into the dependency side. It's getting to the phone. It's a family-based program to provide social services. I wanted the social workers to get into the home to find out what are some of the underlying traumas and issues that the kids were experiencing. And all of you know that we're finding a lot of things going on. Siblings, grandparents are raising young children, struggling to make ends meet, no food, no electric, no gas, and we're able to do that. And then the youth is referred into programming. And he will spend sometimes between 3 to 6 months. Some kids will go longer. Some kids, because when the service workers get there, they realize the kid made a stupid mistake and he or she doesn't need any programming or go into any diversion model, and they make that decision because they're authorized to do that, and that begins the process. One of the things you don't see on my list is a stick. I can't address the issue around suspension, but we do not go back after a child. There's no fines or fees or costs associated with our program. If the kid or family does not complete the program, we're fine with that as well. We give them a collateral consequences conversation about what could happen if they were arrested. A large percentage and the majority of my kids are not coming back, but we did not feel the need to have a consequence. So we were going to meet families at the level of respect and meet with them where they need it. If I arrested them, I have wrap around, wrap over, wrap under services. But if I didn't, what are we going to do? And so we felt it was very important not to put those youth through it. My kids go to their programs, community-based programs. So they're in the community, being serviced by the community. They go where they live, not where they're arrested. Many of our kids move across the city And so it may take them an hour and a half to get to school. It made no sense to make them go to the program where their schools are located, so they go in their neighborhood, and they also provided with transportation and support. The program providers also go to their home twice a week, and then the families come to the center once a week. We do family engagement. The program is all built around bringing the family together and working collectively with them, and also identifying other issues in the family. And what does the program provide? These are 6 programs. They all, though run differently, have these core components to them. Academic support, where they can work with the students. They're going to make contact with the schools, see how they're doing academically, see where some of their needs are. I won't go through all of these, but some of the key ones that jump out are engaged with parental involvement. A lot of our kids come from single-parent homes, struggling, single parents who are struggling to raise their children. So a lot of work is done to help support that. I mean, the ultimate goal is I cannot take many of these kids out of some of the more toxic stress in the environment they live in. But what we can do is hope to build the skills for them to manage their behavior and be very successful moving forward. In the Work Ready program, many of our kids, they're taken on trips. We have kids who are in our communities who've never left their communities, and just taking them to an event 3 miles from their house, it's as if they were leaving the city. And so it's very important part of the component is that they're given recreational time and taken out of their community and taken them to places where they can begin to spread their wings. One of the things exciting about, we changed policy. This wasn't a legal change. This wasn't any change in the book. Our Safe School Act said the school district had a mandatory to report to us. What the Safe School Act did not say that we were mandatory to make an arrest. And so we made the decision by not making arrests, we would drop by 71% reduction in our school-based arrests based solely on making a decision that we would no longer arrest those youth. As you can see in the red, it represents the number of kids we've moved into diversion. We're pushing over 2,000 youth that we have moved into our diversionary model now, where they are provided with the services that they need to help them in their process. Was also, we challenged and pushed back, well, if you want to do this diversion, you're going to have all these kids who are going to do these things because of. Well, this graph here represents that when we started, in 2014, the year prior in 2013, it was over 6,300 kids, incidents reported in school. These are overall incidences, not just incidents where kids could be arrested. And we've dropped almost 14%, over 14, close to 15% since we started. So we're not seen, the world has not come to an end. The safety of the kids have not gone off the charts. We've been able to demonstrate that by taking this method, it works effectively. One of the things, the most exciting part of our work is really being able to see the numbers. As depicted here, we have a control group. Drexel is doing a research. It was started out as a 4-year evaluation. We got an extension in their grant recently, so it's almost a 7-year longitudinal study. The red line represents the kids who were arrested the year prior, before we started diversion. 27% of those kids are coming recidivating, and these are recidivation. Most of the recidivation here is happening in the community, and of that kid, and all 1,600 of those kids were arrested. So all 1,600 were arrested. 27% of those kids have been reoffended. The blue line below represents the kids who have diverted, and in those cases, none of those kids have been arrested at all, and 14% of those kids have been are recidivating. And so we're really excited to see how the impact we're having by not arresting kids, by not creating fees and fines for them, by not making them be rearrested if they don't complete the process. We actually have youth who do not complete who parents say they do not want programming from us, and even in those cases, those kids are doing extremely well. And so we're excited that we're going in the right direction. As we expand our model now, we're moving out into doing beyond just the school base, moving into retail theft in the community now to divert youth in that space, building regional youth courts around the city to address some of the upstream suspensions. But from a department perspective and from the institute I'm in the process of building now, we're really pushing education, training, and the like, that the law enforcement can be a very effective tool in this process, that we do not need to put these youth into these systems, particularly youth who have these low-level offense, And by doing that, we can totally change your trajectory. So I'll stop there and again, thank everyone for the opportunity to be on the call and pass it back to you, Selena.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters today for sharing their insights, their experiences, and approaches with our audience. Are there any final questions? If you have questions, you can type them in the chat box at this time. We do have our presenters' contact information if you'd like more in-depth information about what was shared today. And the slides are located in the right-hand corner. You can actually download the slides. Okay. So I guess we have no questions. If you would make sure that you keep an eye on our TA Telegram. We have some upcoming trainings with our cultural linguistic competence TA team related to immigration, as well as children of incarcerated parents. And so take a look at that and make sure you register for upcoming trainings. We look forward to our next peer learning exchange with you all. Okay. Yes, thank you so much, Tara. So our next peer learning exchange is the Human Resources and Workforce Development Strategies to Enhance and Expand Cultural Linguistic Competence and Systems of Care. That webinar is May 16th, 1:30 to 2:30, and Dr. Gamache will be presenting from our Cultural Linguistic Competence team. We also have an evaluation survey we'd like for all of our participants to complete. It's in the chat box. We want to thank our presenters again, and if there aren't any final questions, we thank you for your participation in our webinar, and we look forward to the next time with you. Have a good afternoon.
You too.